You didn't notice it when it started. There was no moment, no decision, no clear before and after. Just a version of you that slowly became easier to be, and another version that slowly became quieter. At first, it felt like growth, like maturity, like learning how the world worked. But somewhere inside that adjustment, something subtle began to shift, not disappear, just step back. And here's the question most people never think to ask. If you didn't lose yourself all at once, then when did it actually begin? It usually starts small, so small you don't even recognize it as a change. A pause before you speak, a laugh that isn't fully yours, a sentence you rewrite in your head before letting it out. You notice what works, what gets a reaction, what makes people lean in instead of away, and without deciding to, you adjust. Psychologists often describe this as social adaptation, our ability to subtly shape ourselves in response to the environment around us. It's not fake, it's functional. A child learns quickly which version of themselves is welcomed and which one creates discomfort, so they lean into what works. A lower tone, a different opinion, a softer edge, not because they're pretending, but because it feels safer, and the world rewards safety. A student stops asking certain questions because they're laughed at once. An employee starts agreeing more because disagreement feels risky. Someone in a relationship becomes easier to avoid conflict. Each adjustment feels temporary. But here's the part most people don't realize. What you repeat for acceptance begins to feel like who you are. And if that's true, what happens to the parts of you that don't get repeated? They don't disappear. They just stop being seen. There's a version of you that spoke more freely, that reacted without filtering, that had preferences you didn't need to explain. But when those parts don't get reinforced, they slowly lose their place in your everyday life. Some researchers believe that identity is shaped not just by what we express, but by what gets acknowledged. So when certain parts of you are ignored or rejected, they don't vanish. They become background. Think about someone who used to draw constantly as a child. Then one day, someone said, "You're not that good." They didn't argue. They just stopped. Years later, if you ask them, they'll say, "I'm not really a creative person." But that's not entirely true. It's just the version of them that was creative stopped being practiced, not erased, just unused. And here's where it becomes uncomfortable. If parts of you can go unused for years, how much of you is still there, but no longer active? At some point, the adaptation becomes invisible. You stop noticing the difference between who you are and who you've learned to be, because the version that gets accepted becomes the version that feels natural. You laugh at things you didn't used to find funny. You agree faster. You hesitate more. And it doesn't feel forced anymore. It feels like you. Research suggests that the brain is incredibly efficient at reinforcing patterns that reduce social friction. In other words, the easier a version of you makes life, the more your mind encourages you to stay there, even if it's not fully you. There's a man who describes himself as low maintenance. He says he doesn't need much, doesn't ask for much, doesn't expect much. People like being around him. He's easy. But when he's alone, there's a strange emptiness he can't explain. Because what he calls low maintenance might actually be something else. A version of himself that learned not to need too much because needing felt inconvenient to others. And the hardest part? He doesn't know what he actually wants anymore. Because he got so good at being acceptable, he forgot what was original. So now the question changes. If the version of you that's accepted feels real, how would you even recognize the parts that aren't? This is where the split begins. Not a dramatic one, a quiet one. On the outside, everything works. You function, you adapt, you belong. But internally, something feels slightly off, not wrong enough to panic, just misaligned. Psychologists sometimes describe this as internal incongruence, a gap between internal experience and external behavior. But it doesn't feel like a gap. It feels like a low, constant hum. A sense that something is slightly out of place, without knowing what. A woman describes it like this: "I feel like I'm living a life that fits me, but doesn't belong to me." She has the right job, the right circle, the right rhythm. Nothing is obviously wrong. And yet, there's a quiet question she avoids. If I stopped adjusting, what would be left? Because that question is unsettling. It suggests that what's working might not be fully true. And over time, something even stranger happens. The tension starts to feel normal. You don't notice it fading. That's what makes it so powerful. You don't wake up one day and say, I've lost myself. You wake up and continue exactly as you've been. Because forgetting doesn't feel like forgetting. It feels like familiarity. Some researchers suggest that identity is deeply tied to memory, not just what we remember, but what we repeatedly access. So when certain parts of you stop being accessed, they don't feel lost. They feel irrelevant. A woman hears a song she used to love. Suddenly, something shifts. Not nostalgia. Something deeper. A version of herself reappears for a moment how she used to think, feel, exist. And then it's gone again. Not because it disappeared, but because it's no longer part of her current pattern. And in that moment, she realizes something unsettling. She didn't lose that version of herself. She just stopped visiting it. So now the question becomes, if you can reconnect with a version of yourself through a memory, is it really gone? Strip everything away for a second. No expectations, no roles, no reactions from other people. Just you. Who are you when there's no one to respond to? It's a harder question than it sounds, because so much of identity is relational. Psychologists often observe that when external validation disappears, people can experience a kind of identity, uncertainty, not because they're empty, but because they've spent so long being reflected, they forgot how to exist without a mirror. A woman travels alone for the first time. No one knows her. No one expects anything from her. At first, it feels freeing. Then something unexpected happens. She doesn't know how to choose simple things. What to eat, where to go, what she even enjoys. Because so many of her choices were shaped by who she was with. And now, without that reference point, she feels undefined. Which leads to a deeper realization. If your identity depends on who's around you, what happens when no one is? And yet, something begins to shift. Not all at once, quietly, without announcement. When you stop performing a version of yourself, even briefly, something else starts to surface. Not a completely new person, something familiar. But distant, like hearing your own voice played back after years. At first, it feels unfamiliar, then slowly recognizable. Some researchers suggest that identity isn't something we discover once, but something we continuously reconstruct, which means what feels lost might not be gone, just unpracticed. A man starts writing again after 10 years. At first, it feels forced. Then one sentence lands differently. Then another, and suddenly something clicks. Not new, but remember. And he realizes he didn't become someone else. He just stopped being someone he once was. So maybe this was never about losing yourself. Maybe it was about learning how to leave, gradually, quietly, without noticing. And maybe that's why it feels so confusing. Because there's no single moment to return to, no clear version to reclaim, just fragments, moments, patterns, pieces that still exist but aren't fully integrated. So the real question was never, who did you become? It was always, which parts of you did you stop bringing with you? And now, something changes. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. You start noticing the pauses, the adjustments, the automatic responses. But instead of judging them, you begin to recognize them, not as flaws, as adaptation, as decisions that once made sense. And that changes everything. Because if those versions of you were learned, they can also be unlearned, not by force, but by awareness, by choice, by slowly allowing different parts of yourself to come forward again. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to feel something shift. Enough to feel something return. You didn't notice it when it started. There was no moment, no decision. Just a version of you that became easier to be. And another that became quieter. But now you see something you couldn't see before. The quieter version never left. It was never gone. It was just waiting for you to stop choosing silence. And the moment you begin to hear it again, that's not the moment you find yourself. It's the moment you realize you were never completely lost,